Exercise 6, the classification of tissues. So here we're going to start working from the ground up. So we've already covered cells, and these cells are going to be the building blocks of life. These were covered earlier. And now we're going to build on these. So after you've got these cells, remember when we were talking about the cellular organization, to just jump right in, we went from cells, and then these will join together, and then the next part will be our tissues. And when we have these tissues, these are going to be groups of cells. And these groups of cells are similar in structure and function. So that's the how things work together, A and P piece. Cells come together to form tissues, which come together to form organs. And these organs are going to be tissues that perform a specific function. So they're all going to come together, all different types of tissues, and be able to produce some sort of function. And then these organs are going to all come together to form a system. And the system is going to be a group of organs. And this group of organs is then going to perform an even higher specific function. So if we're looking at these cells, essentially we talked about the cell as a generic composite cell previously. We're living in this world of tissue right here. These tissues are going to be an example of your muscular tissue. Then your muscular tissue is going to be combined with a couple other different types of tissues in order to create your heart, which would be your cardiac muscle, but it's also going to have nerve tissue. It's going to also have some other kinds of tissues. That organ, the heart is an organ. That organ will then live inside a system, which would be your cardiovascular system, where you're going to have your blood, your vessels, your heart, which are going to be different organs that are coming together to pump blood around the body, which is the specific function that it does. So we're blending into this this semester. We've already covered cells. We're covering tissues today. And then next week, we're actually going to start with our first organ system with integumentary. So as we're going, we're going to look at a bunch of slides today. So I've put those into this PowerPoint so we can look at them. And so when you see the word or the term histology, just as a reminder, histology just means the study of tissues. And since we cannot see these tissues with the naked eye, they're not as small as cells, but they're not as big as organs. Usually this does require a microscope. So unfortunately, since we're not in lab, we won't get to look at these real time, but through mastering A&P and your lab manual, you will be able to. So for our tissues, there are actually 4 types of tissue. The 4 types of tissue are going to be epithelium. You may also see epithelia, which just means the plural version of it. Connective, muscle tissue, and then nerve tissue. So we're going to spend most of today talking about these two. When we get to muscle and nervous tissue, we're going to cover these specifically after the midterm. So we're going to focus on epithelium and connective tissue. So we're just going to dive right on into the first kind, epithelial tissue. And these slides over here all relate to epithelial tissue. So the goal of epithelial tissue, the why we have it, is we need it to cover any of our surfaces. So it'll cover internal surfaces, it'll cover external surfaces, it'll line cavities inside our body, and then glands will be made up of epithelial tissue. So, but really it's going to be a covering. With that, what is its function? So for all of these, we're going to do its function. So since it covers things, it involves with protection. It's also involved with absorption in order to bring things into the system. It's involved with filtration, keeping some things out, some things in, excretion, getting rid of waste, secretion, which is getting rid of a product that has been made, and sensory reception. So all of these are the functions of epithelial tissue, which is why we need all of these pieces when it's lining our internal, our external cavities and our glands. So all epithelial tissue is going to have a general characteristic or a couple of general characteristics. So all of them are going to kind of fall into these overarching structural characteristics. First one is that there's going to be something called polarity. Polarity simply means that there's going to be a top and a bottom. So there's going to be this right here is going to be considered the apical, and this is going to be considered the basal surface. So the apical surface is going to be the free surface. So remember, epithelial tissue covers things. So here's an example of our epithelial tissue. It is going to be, let's say this is some sort of organ right here. This is covering it. So when it is covering something, there is always going to be an apical surface and a basal surface. Basically, an easy way to think about this is the apical surface is going to be essentially where there's no other tissue. It is going to be empty. If that's a good way to think of it, have at it. Apical surface is the open or the free surface. It's the top. This basement surface, basal actually stands for basement, so it's the bottom. And you'll notice that this layer right here is attached to other things. So it's not empty, it's attached. So you're going to have two sides to our epithelial tissue. It's going to be a free side. It's got this polarity characteristic, a top and a bottom. It's also going to have all of your cells that are going to be very, very, very close together. In general, epithelium is going to be kind of waterproof or water resistant. So your cells are going to fit very close together. There is not going to be a whole lot of space for things to be able to move between the cells. All of these cells are going to be supported by a basement membrane. So, like I said, think about the basal surface. When we've got this basal surface, it is not free. It is the surface that is always attached to something. You'll notice right here that I'm going to erase this so you can see it. There's this little kind of, you can see right here. That's our basement membrane. This whole thing has to be attached to some surface. So I like to think of our epithelial cells as little Legos. And with these little Legos, all of them are going to be attached to another surface. So if you've ever done Legos and you have that green Lego glass that you would put the Legos on to kind of build a house or whatever, that is going to be the basement membrane, whereas the Legos are all going to sit nicely on top. Another characteristic of our epithelial tissue is that it is avascular. There is no blood supply. So blood will be in the underlying tissues. It will not actually have any blood vessels found in this top layer of your epithelial tissue. But what's really cool is that they are able to regenerate. These cells have the ability to regenerate a lot because, remember, they are involved with protection. This is the biggest one. With that protection, they are going to be the barrier between the inside surface or the internal environment and the external environment. If there's any kind of caustic external environment and you lose this layer and you lose some protection, you need to be able to generate it really, really quickly. So think about your skin. You're constantly rubbing up against things. You're outside in the weather, hot and cold. You're constantly losing skin cells. So your skin needs to be able to regenerate rapidly, so you always have that protective layer. When you're looking at your epithelial tissues, they are going to be classified by two criteria. They are classified by two specific things. The first one is going to be the cell arrangement. And this is just a fancy word for saying how the Legos are put together into how many layers. So the cell arrangement is going to mean layers. You can have a arrangement, and a simple is one layer, or you can have a stratified arrangement. And a stratified is going to be essentially more than one, 2 plus. So this, you can have these guys called by their arrangement. So right here is an example of, here's my simple. There's only one layer. Here is my stratified. There's lots and lots of layers. So that's one way you can classify them, is by the cell arrangement. Another way you can classify these is by cell shape. So that's going to be the actual structure of the cell. So with this, there's three kinds. You can have a shape that is squamous. A squamous cell is going to be scale-like, super flat. I like to describe these as kind of like pancakes. They are super flat and scale-like. Then you could also have a cuboidal shape. A cuboidal shape is essentially exactly what the name is. It's a cube. Or you can have a columnar shape. And when you have a columnar shape, it's going to be a column, essentially taller than it is wide. All of these are also going to have that nuclei in it. So remember, these guys are all able to regenerate. They can only regenerate because they have nuclei. So all of these are going to have nuclei in it that are going to be very helpful to find out what's going on. So when we're looking at this cell shape, here's our squamous, here's our cube, and here's our column. But what is happening with these is you can actually put them all together. So all epithelials will first start with arrangement, followed by shape. So all epithelial tissues will be named by the arrangement, followed by shape. So we're going to have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. Then we're going to have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. So to zoom on over to these guys, I'm going to zoom in on this guy a little bit. This is our stratified, we're going to start simple squamous. So you'll notice that this is going to be essentially a single layer and it's flat cells. That's what that is called. So when you're looking at this, you'll notice that it is only one nuclei thick. You can tell it's only one nuclei thick, and that gives it the definition of single layer. This is actually found in your lungs. This picture right here is from your lungs. It'll show up again when we get to respiratory system, but that will be in AMP2. The next kind you have is simple cuboidal. So again, it is going to be a single layer, but these are cube-like cells. So this one's a little bit trickier to see because remember, there always has to be a base, a basal surface, and a free surface. So technically, these guys are going to be little donuts, where here is my empty space. That's my apical surface. Here is my basal surface. And do you see these cell membrane walls? That is going to be my cell. And then here's my nuclei. So that's a simple cuboidal. If I were to cut this and put it out in one line, it looks like this. So just keep in mind, this is a three-dimensional. You kind of have to manipulate your three-dimensional space, get your brain working a little bit. But these guys right here, so this is my basement membrane. This is my apical surface. But here are my plasma membrane. So that's a simple cuboidal. They're one layer thick, but they're cube-like cells. The next kind is going to be our simple columnar. So with our simple columnar, we're doing the exact same thing. This is a single layer, tall cells. So when you're looking at here, this is going to be my apical surface. See how it is empty. If it is empty or free, that is the apical surface. Right here, this will be my basal surface. And you can see how the nuclei are in here, and then here is your plasma membrane. So you can see with these simple columnar how your nuclei tend to line up very, very pretty in a row. Okay, so another type of cell you actually have is something called pseudo-stratified columnar. Pseudo-stratified columnar. So this is going to be an extra special one. Pseudo-stratified columnar. Pseudo means fake. So essentially this is fake stratified. So this is actually going to be one layer thick. So it's not stratified. It is actually considered simple, but it doesn't look like it. It's actually going to be one layer, but it looks stratified, so it's called pseudo-stratified. It is one layer thick, and it is going to be in a column shape, but the columns are not going to be even, and the nuclei will be at different heights. That nuclei at different heights is what gives it the pseudo-stratified appearance. So zoom in back on this guy. It is a single layer, but the cells are of differing heights. They may not all reach the free surface. So here's my apical surface. Here's my basal surface. And you'll notice here is my nuclei. And then here is a plasma membrane. Here's a nuclei. Here's a plasma membrane. Here's a nuclei. So you can kind of see how, because the nuclei are not all in one row, so this would be a very pretty columnar, simple columnar. It's not that. It is actually more like this. However, these are only one layer tall. But if you look at that, it looks like there's multiple heights to these guys, but it is not. That's why it's called pseudo-stratified. And these are usually going to also be ciliated. They've got these on the top. So they're usually going to be ciliated. But that's pseudo-stratified columnar. Okay, you then also, that's all of our simple. Now we've got our stratified squamous. So we're going to start this way. So this is going to be several cell layers, and this is technically going to be stratified squamous. However, with this stratified, it is going to be the bottom layer are cuboidal or columnar. It is the top layer that is squamous. So there's so many of these guys that this top layer right here is our flat pancakes. But down here you can see how they have a little bit of a different shape. So simple squamous. They are named for that top layer of cells where they are flattened. Another one you've got is going to be transitional. So transitional is a little bit different. It is also going to be a stratified squamous. However, this is found in places where your body needs the ability to stretch or slide. So here is going to be my cells that are all put together in some really flat layered way. But what you can get is all of these nicely put in a line, stretched out so you can increase the area. These are going to be found specifically in your bladder. So they are going to look and be very similar to a stratified squamous, but they have the ability for all these pancake scale-like cells to slide over each other and stretch out, so that way you have the ability to stretch. You need to have that ability for your bladder when it fills up. So that is transitional. So that's the epithelial tissue we're going to look at today. The next type of tissue we're going to have is going to be connective. So just like epithelial, we're going to go through some of the main themes of these connective tissues. This is actually the most abundant and widely distributed type of tissue. This is the most widely distributed. The overall function for this type of tissue is support. It is the infrastructure. It'll also be involved in protection. But another thing that connective tissue does is it will bind other tissues together. So it's going to act kind of like a glue or a binding mechanism. So an example of connective tissue is actually bones. So if you think about it, you have a lot of bone, so therefore it's a very abundant. So some general characteristics of connective tissue before we go into the different types. General characteristics. These are highly vascularized. So they are different than epithelial tissue, which was avascular. So these are going to have a lot of blood supply. They're going to be made up of lots of different cell types. So at the epithelial tissue, we talked essentially about simple, squamous, and then the three shapes. So we kind of limited ourselves to how many cell types there are. That is not true in connective tissue. There's going to be lots and lots and lots of different cell types that come together to make up this tissue. And then one thing that's different about this connective tissue is there will be a thing called an extracellular matrix. And this is kind of what makes that glue factor happen. So all connective tissue will have something called an extracellular matrix. And it's going to be found between connective tissue cells, outside of the connective tissue cells. That's the extracellular part. And it's essentially just a bunch of material that is non-cellular but is considered living. So what is the extracellular matrix? It is responsible for strength, and it is going to be found with these two components of our extracellular matrix. All of them will have this. First one will be called something called ground substance. Now I find this a little tricky because ground substance is actually going to be a fluid. So it's the fluid between the cells. And the to me, I don't know, for some reason, whenever I hear ground substance, I think of something solid, but it's not. Ground substance is actually going to be a fluid, and it is going to be an interstitial fluid, so it's between the cells. This may be semi-hard, semi-solid, maybe liquid, but it's going to err on that side of more of the liquid semi-solid phrase. Okay, and then you're also going to have something called a fiber. So you're going to have some sort of liquid, gluish type of material, and you're going to have a fiber. And the fiber is support. Or the ground substance is kind of like the glue, the fiber is the support. So we're going to have three types of fibers, and these are actually going to be familiar. The first type of fiber is going to be collagen. Collagen usually shows up as a white fiber. You're also going to have elastic or elastin. This shows up as a yellow fiber. And then you're going to have one called reticular. And that will show up as a fine white because essentially it is a fine collagen fiber. So for the females in the group, if you've ever bought some sort of beauty product that is talking about collagen and elastin, it's essentially trying to build up these fibers that are found in your connective tissue that essentially are the support for your skin. So these fibers are the building blocks. So I like to describe this as a bridge. Underneath the bridge, there is always going to be that network of some sort of stanchions or work or any kind of support mechanism underneath. This support is actually going to be your fibers. Where if this is the road on top, this is actually going to be your skin. So you want a very smooth road. You don't want a bumpy road. So you want to make sure that your fibers, collagen, elastic, and reticulin, are where they're supposed to be. Otherwise, if you don't have those fibers, your bridge will collapse. And that is actually where wrinkles come from. So just a fun fact of the day on how all of that comes together. So with this connective tissue, there are 4 types or classifications of connective tissue. The first one is going to be connective tissue proper. And this is going to be the ones that have all of these mechanisms, have all of these pieces, are very easy to see as connective tissue. There's going to be areolar, adipose, reticular, and one called dense, which is going to have a lot of fibers. So we're going to have our connective tissue proper. We're going to have areolar, adipose, reticular, and dense. So here we go up here. Our connective tissue proper, areolar. You can see if we were to zoom in on this guy, how you've got your elastin fiber. Then you're going to have your collagen fiber. Then all of the white space is actually going to be your ground substance. So that's going to be you can kind of see how all that, it's literally fibers that go through your tissue. Then you're also going to have adipose. This is going to be your fat tissue. So this is really, really important. You'll notice that this is actually not the cell. This is actually a fat droplet. So it's clear. The cell is around this guy. So there's the nuclei. But this type of tissue can store fat droplets in it. They look clear, so that's what you're seeing here. Do not get the adipose tissue and the simple squamous tissue confused. Here's reticular tissue, where you're still able to see the fibers, but it's called reticular fibers. So the it's reticular tissue, so the reticular fibers stand out even more. And then here's dense regular. So this one is going to have a lot of fibers. And you'll notice how there's not a whole lot of ground substance coming through because it is very, very dense. So those are the first type of connective tissue. And then there's another one called dense irregular. But these are both going to be that dense tissue. Okay, so then we have connective tissue that is connective tissue proper. Then we're also going to have connective tissue that is cartilage. Cartilage will be essentially, here is an example of hyaline cartilage, and here is an example of elastic cartilage, and here is an example of fibrocartilage. For lab, the best one to look at is hyaline cartilage. So this is the one I would look at when you're looking at this. But cartilage is going to be one of the types of connective tissue. And then you're going to have bone. So when we get to skeletal system in 2 weeks, all of your bones are considered connective tissue, as well as all of your blood. So all of your blood are considered connective tissue. So here is your bone. We'll talk more about this, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you need to be able to kind of recognize it. Bone is connective tissue, and so is blood. So those are the main 2 types that we're going to talk about in this particular the midterm, this particular part of the class, but you do have 2 other kinds. So you will have the 3rd type, which is going to be muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is going to be highly, highly, highly specialized, and it is going to be specialized mainly to contract or shorten. So as it contracts or shortens, it's going to produce body movements. So that is why we need this muscle tissue in order to produce movement of the body. These cells are elongated. So all these cells are going to be very, very different. We're going to talk about why, but they're going to be elongated. So one cell is going to be more like a straw rather than a Lego. And there are going to be 3 types. We're not going to go into the difference of the 3 types right now, but you need to know what they are. The first type is going to be skeletal. Skeletal muscle. This is going to be the ones that connected to our skeleton. Then we're going to have cardiac, which is going to be our heart muscle. And then we're going to have smooth. And our smooth muscle is what's responsible for moving our walls of our organs, pumping our blood around our body, moving things through our digestive tract. All of that is going to be smooth muscle. And then those are the 3 types of tissues. The 4th type is going to be nervous tissue. And again, we're not going to talk a lot about this because this is going to be the latter half of the course. And we're talking about nervous tissue. This is also going to be highly specialized, but it's not specialized to contract. It will be specialized to communicate. So it's going to be the telephone system inside of our body. So the type of cell that we're going to talk about here is going to be mainly neurons. So we'll talk a lot about these. So to drive on down and look at these guys, Here is your skeletal muscle. It looks a little different. See how these are very long cells. Then you've got cardiac muscle. Again, it's a long cell. And then our smooth muscle, which are long cells, but really flat ones. So those are the three types of muscle tissue that we'll talk about after the midterm. And then here is an example of the nervous tissue, which looks like a very different type of cell. These look like this. So that will be our neuron. When we get to the second half of AMP 1, we'll talk a lot about the nervous tissue and the neuron, but it's responsible for communication. So that is it for this exercise to focus on the classification of tissues.